Okay, this is just a short recording just to talk again about conclusions, to remind you that the question is, Heaney's presentation of the landscape reveals the depth and despair in the face of growing conflict. As I said before, the conclusion is really important because it synthesizes the argument. I like it when students say, as stated above, or show that it is genuinely the end of the argument, and that what you're going to do here is to directly answer the question and to give your take-home message for their examiner. It's also good to put something profound or interesting in there and to write really expressively. So I'll try and model that in an introduction that I just wrote in the last 8 minutes there while I was writing with you. So in answer to this would be my concluding statement. In North and Croppies, Heaney vividly portrays the long history of violence that cursed the Irish shores. As detailed above, both the oral and visual imagery of the poems captures the graphic violence of the endless Viking feuds and the methodical slaughter of the imperialistic British army. However, and here again I want to reiterate how important it is that you show that you've looked at both sides of the statement, that to some degree you agreed with one, but then you're now switching over to the other view. Whereas the landscape in North, hammered out by Thor, the ruthless god of war, remains steeped in violence and conquest, in Croppies the land has begun to regenerate. Although Croppies is a requiem and its tone is largely somber, the regenerated symbolism of the barley shoots appears to herald the promise of new life. In contrast, the narrator of North does not find solace in the landscape, but instead he retreats into his art, burrowing himself into the creations of his pen. Therefore, Heaney's portrayal of the Irish landscape is complex, and although there are many moments of despair and anguish, it would be reductive to see his verses without hope and devoid of a belief, even if the contemporary world is steeped in violence and recrimination. So I go back to the title as much as possible. I show both sides of the title, but I show that if we were to simply agree with the title, that would be a reductive reading. So I like that language. You can always use the language where you talk about which is the stronger or the more compelling reading. Remember that literature is never about proof. It's never about only one way of looking at things. But you as a reader are allowed to say which of the readings you find more compelling, more supported by the text, more interesting. And don't forget, you can often show that some quotations apply only to pieces of an author's work, that there's far more complexity than that. That's why when you state your view, these are the kind of sentence stems or some of the lexical phrases that I think would be very useful, is to talk about reductive readings, limited perspective, because you're only looking at some of the poems. You could talk about more expansive perspective. You could talk about richer readings or more sophisticated interpretations or a more nuanced understanding. These are all very good little lexical items for conclusions because they show evaluation. They show here I'm stating how far I agree with the statement above. Remember, because you're asked, to what extent you agree with it. And you need to say to a large extent, or largely I agree with this, or, I almost entirely disagree with this. It doesn't matter what your judgment is, as long as you've really nuanced and worked out why you've arrived at that particular view. Another very useful one is to say view X, or whatever the view is based on a selective reading. That's often the case with someone like Heaney, because Heaney goes through so many different phases and transitions. As he's writing, so the history of Northern Ireland and Ireland is changing. And the kind of tone of his poems, the way in which he looks at history, the degrees of violence, ideas of gender change as he becomes, as he moves into the more modern world with feminist concerns, etc. You can see his gendering of the land changes, etc. And finally, you can talk about, therefore, a more holistic conception. which takes into account the richness of Heaney's many works. All of those phrases are very useful for doing that, and I hope that was useful for you.